Well, this is intimate, isn't it? Nice small audience together. This might break the record for me for the largest audience I've presented in front of. I'm not going to bother doing a head count because that might take a little bit of time. But thanks ever so much for coming. And yeah, it's great to be here. My first time in Kiev, first time in Ukraine. And I have a hangover to show for it already. Last night was fun. And tonight will probably be fun too. Hopefully not as fun as last night. I'm going to do a presentation for you about gin. Some of you may know that I wrote a gin book about 3 years ago. And that took me on a kind of journey through around 60 distilleries. Most of them in the UK, but some distilleries in America and across Europe. And a couple further afield from there as well. And the interesting thing about writing about gin is there's no shortage of history about it. We've had things like the gin craze and the birth of some of the big gin brands way back in the 1800s, Tanqueray, Beefeater, and all the origins of gin with Geneva and the Netherlands and all that kind of thing. It's a fascinating subject. But what we don't talk that much about yet is the recent history of gin. And the last 20 years are perhaps the most important period in gin's long history because so much has happened, so much has changed in the world of gin. I started bartending about 20 years ago, and I remember gin was not cool at all. Drinking a gin and tonic was not cool. I used to actually drink them, and at that time, in the UK at least, that drink was seen as being something that middle-aged women drank, perhaps women that kept cats and weren't married. And it was just not a drink that was generally ordered over a bar. It still tasted the same as it does now. Still delicious back then as it is now, but it wasn't socially seen as a drink that you would be ordering. Around that time, I was drinking quite a lot of Malibu and Coke as well, so that gives you an idea of the climate in the bar industry around 2000. So things have changed dramatically. Virtually every country in the world has a gin distillery now. In the UK, virtually every town has a gin distillery. They pop up like mushrooms in the night at the moment. And although I've written a book about gin, and I love gin cocktails, I love drinking gin, I have been predicting every year now for about the past 5 years that this bubble of gin is going to burst soon. And every single year, not only am I proven wrong, but the bubble keeps getting bigger. When is it going to end? Well, it will end at some point, but when it does end, the landscape of the back bar, that view of all the different gin brands, will have changed permanently. We're past the days of 1 or 2 brands on a back bar now. There will always, from now on, be 6 or 10 or 15 different gins on a back bar because it gives consumers a chance to experiment with a product that they're now pretty familiar with, and they can customize their night out based on the gin they're drinking. So yeah, I wanted to do a talk about the last 20 years, and it occurred to me, well, let's structure it around the number 20. 20 years, let's identify 20 things in those 20 years that have really changed gin. And I've ordered those 20 things loosely in order of importance, with the most important events at the end of the talk. So if anyone's thinking of walking out early, you need to wait till the end to get to the juiciest bits, okay? Now, you may disagree with me about my order. The order is kind of arbitrary, but it makes it a fun game, kind of predicting what's going to come next. So, without further ado, let us begin. Let us begin. Let us begin. No, that's not working. I've worked it out. There's a switch that says on and off. Let's try that now. Yes. So, you've got that there, cool. So, coming in at sort of number 20 is the launch of Aviation Gin in the United States. Now, this gin was launched in 2007, named of course, after the cocktail, the aviation with creme de violette, and actually lavender is one of the botanicals in this gin. Now, when it was launched in 2007, it was seen as being quite a deviation away from the gins that were in the market at that time. And of course, I'm talking about products like Tanqueray, Gordon's, Beefeater, Bombay Sapphire, which are all juniper-driven gins. And this gin did not taste so strongly of juniper. It still tastes of juniper, but just not, it's not necessarily the dominant flavor. Now, that kind of upset a few people, but Ryan Magarian, who is a bartender, who partnered with a spirits company in the US, sort of set out a kind of manifesto around what this gin was about and what it meant for the category. And in doing that, he created a new style of gin that he called New Western. And the idea was to move it away from the traditional juniper-driven gins, which we call London Dry. We don't really use that term that much anymore, but it's still a legal term under the EU law. And he said, this isn't a London Dry gin. It's not juniper dominant. This has other botanical flavors that are prominent in it. And if you taste aviation today, it doesn't seem outlandish or cavalier or maverick, really, in any particular way, because we're now, 10 years on or 11 years on, we have so many gins that don't really taste of juniper, and some that don't taste of juniper at all. But this was kind of the first one that said, you know what, it's okay to not be juniper-driven. It's okay to have other prominent botanicals within the blend. And the other interesting thing about aviation gin was that Ryan was a bartender. And that kind of paved the way for bartender and brand collaborations, or indeed bartenders starting their own brands, which, again, is something commonplace these days. You'll see a lot of brands being launched by bartenders, whether it's mixers for drinks or gin brands or whatever. So pretty important time for gins that weren't juniper dominant and for bartenders. It's important to emphasize, though, that aviation wasn't the first American gin. There's a long history of gin in America going way back to the early 20th century. But, and it wasn't the first gin in the sort of modern era either. There were ones that came before it. Junipero, for example, springs to mind. But it was just a change in a flavor profile. Next one. Now, you might find as we go through this, some of this stuff is reasonably UK-centric. That's because that's where I'm from. It's because I know the market there better than I do other places. However, the UK has been really important in leading the surge towards new gin brands, new distilleries, and developing the product, gin and tonics, all that kind of thing. So I do think it is important to emphasize that the UK is role in all of this. So the Martini Trolley at the Connaught and Duke's Martini Serves. Now, the Connaught and Duke's are both legendary five-star hotels. I'm sure some of you have been lucky enough to visit them. You go to the Connaught, you might see this man, Agostino Peron. You go to Duke's, it's Alessandro Palazzi, who is a career bartender. I don't know how old he is, but he's getting on a little bit. I hope he doesn't mind me saying that. And of course, he does a legendary martini serve at Duke's, where the gin is produced out of the freezer. Tiny bit of vermouth is spritzed into a frozen glass, and then he just pours 100 ml of frozen gin into the glass. There is no dilution, there's no stirring. It is just that simple. It's obviously quite a strong drink. You're actually not allowed to order more than 2 martinis at Duke's, because it's 200 ml of gin, right? It's a fair old bit of gin to be consuming. And of course, the nature of a martini means you need to drink it pretty quickly for it to maintain its freshness, its coolness. So, limit on 2. Now, I know Alessandro reasonably well, so he's allowed me to have 3 in the past, which is good. I think I did 3 of them in the space of an hour and a half once. And I went to a bar down the road afterwards and literally fell into the broom cupboard trying to get out of it, and then got an Uber home, and it was like 7 o'clock in the evening, and I was absolutely nailed. So I wouldn't advise doing 3. The Connaught introduced a Martini Trolley about 11 or 12 years ago. And you can see Ago working at it here. And the idea was the trolley gets wheeled up to you in the bar, and they prepare a martini for you at your seat. 25 years ago, I was serving people gin, and they were saying to me, oh no, I don't drink gin. It makes me depressed, it makes me cry, it's mother's ruin, and all this kind of thing. And this was kind of like historical baggage that had been handed down over the years and was still penetrating people's minds. And they still had this belief that there was something dangerous about gin. And it is literally a mother to daughter, father to son piece of gossip, hearsay, that's been passed down over the years, and that was generated around the time of the gin craze, when, of course, there was a lot of damage being done by the product that was then known as gin, completely different to the product that we drink today. So consumer education is important to kind of get the facts straight about what gin once was, and then to talk about what it is now. And it's very easy to talk to consumers about gin because gin is quite an easy product to understand. You start with a neutral spirit like vodka, and then you add your botanicals to it. And everyone can relate to botanicals and the flavors they offer because people understand what juniper is. They understand what coriander is. If you're talking about whiskey and you need to talk about things like fermentation, still shape, peat, malting barley, these are not topics that normal consumers are generally comfortable with. It's new learnings for them. Whereas if I say to you, well, it's flavored with orange and juniper and angelica, any consumer can immediately think, right, I understand this product and what it's going to taste like. It's like perfume. So we've had a few different consumer education programs in the UK, which I've got up here, and Gin Journey, which is now global, where they take consumers on a night out to various different bars and serve them gin cocktails that are sponsored by brands. And it's a nice way of getting consumers into bars and ordering drinks and understanding different gin ranges and how bars are using them. And it's great for the brands as well because it's getting exposure for them. The Ginstitute as well in London was a big, they've had something like 40,000 consumers go through. They have a training program there where you actually make your own gin. And that tactile, getting involved with gin, it's an experience again, and it gets people understanding about flavor and talking about it and working out how they're going to introduce gin into the cocktails they make at home, or indeed what cocktails they're going to order in a bar. And yeah, we're now seeing lots of distill your own gin schools with little stills, like 1 or 2 liter stills, where people can throw the botanicals in there, see the distillate come over and kind of taste their product afterwards and take it home. And these innovations, these education programs are doing really, really well, particularly in the UK. Someone should do one in Kiev. Limes and ice. Now, God, this seems like an obvious one now, Decent quality ice in your gin and tonic, a squeeze of lime. It's like gin and tonic 101. But 20 years ago, it really wasn't that simple. No one had standardized a gin and tonic serve at that time. There wasn't a formula for, right, it goes in this glass, this is the ice, and this is the garnish. And all of that changed, or began to change, in 2003. And this was a kind of mystery shopper program that was run by Gordon's. And the idea is you would go in, you'd train a bar how to serve a proper gin and tonic, highball glass, as much cubed ice as you can get in there, a good measure of gin, top it up with fresh carbonated tonic water, and a squeeze of lime in the glass, and then rim the glass with the lime wedge, then drop it in. And I remember when this happened. I remember when this program happened, and it spread like wildfire. All of a sudden, the best way to serve a gin and tonic was this squeeze of lime and rim the glass. And it was the way it was done. It was by me for maybe 5 years of bartending. It was just the way. And consumers would call you out if you didn't do it. And it was a monumental shift from the gin and tonics that we were getting in the 90s, where it's crappy wet ice floating on top, flat tonic water, inappropriate garnish. And after this happened, it was almost like a lemon was just not good enough. A lemon slice did not cut it in a gin and tonic. It had to be lime. That's maybe because the program was innovated by Gordon's and Tanqueray, and it's a green bottle, and lime does happen to pair really well with both of those gins. So yeah, mystery shoppers would come in, and if you serve the right drink to them, then you get 100 quid. There's nothing better than cash to incentivize bartenders into serving stuff in the proper manner. And I guess this sort of opened up the doors for other garnishing. And these days, you can't launch a gin brand without saying, right, this is how you garnish our gin and tonic, and it'll be some herb and fruit combination or whatever. Garnishing is another variable that's been pulled into gin and tonics in recent years that just didn't exist before. And sometimes literally didn't exist. There was no garnish. Gin liqueurs. Now, these are getting bigger and bigger. I recently did a horizontal tasting of the top 100 gins in the UK by sales. And that's both on and off trade combined. And I would say nearly 20 of those gins were liqueurs or sweetened in some way and often flavored in some way, which is crazy. I mean, the idea that gin liqueurs would become so big, I mean, no one would have predicted that 5 or 10 years ago. For starters, it's kind of crazy flavoring a gin because it's already a flavored product. It's like double flavoring, flavor tautology, which is and often they don't end up tasting like gin anyway because so much flavor goes in there, rhubarb and ginger and raspberry and all this kind of thing that you cannot discern the ginniness underneath it all. It's effectively just a liqueur, but consumers are loving it at the moment, and I've got a list here of some of the landmark products that were gin liqueurs. So Hayman's, one of the earliest examples in their 1820 bottling. Now, that was just a sweetened gin. There was no flavor in it, and I think they still do it. And a nice product to use in kind of fizzes and things like that where you didn't need to add any extra sugar. Bramley and Gage is a relatively small brand, but they used to do a lot of flavored gins, gin liqueurs. But really, it was Edinburgh Gin, I think, that gained the kind of mass appeal for flavored gin when they launched theirs in 2012. It's hard to believe. It's only 6 years ago, and now the flavored gin market is substantial. Okay, 3 brands that, again, made a big difference to the landscape of gin. What do these products have in common? Opier, Brockman's, Hoxton. None of them taste like gin. That's what they have in common. They're not gin liqueurs, they're not sweetened. They are made using botanicals, but they don't taste gin. You will not find an ounce of ginniness in any of these products. Opier, heavily spiced. It's kind of got a curried cardamom, cumin note to it. It literally smells like a plate of Indian foods. If you like that kind of thing, then it's delicious. Brockman's, which is flavored with raspberries. And it takes on this really dark, blackcurranty raspberry kind of note to it. And then Hoxton gin, which got a really rough time in the industry in London when it was launched, flavored with grapefruit and coconut. And it basically smells and tastes like sun cream, which is not my idea of a tasty gin. Maybe it's for some people. I'm pretty sure the brand's been pulled now, actually. I haven't seen it around for a while. Now, love them or hate them, there is a point to be made here, and that is that when these products were launched, and they were all launched around about 7 years ago, they really changed, like Ryan Margarian's aviation gin, they changed the landscape, and they said, you know what? We can push this even further, this whole London Dry thing, and we can bottle a product that really does not taste like gin, and yet it still says gin on the label. And in a way, they did some positive work as well, because it got people thinking about what flavors you can put in a bottle of gin. It started teaching people that juniper didn't need to be the be-all and end-all, and actually, you can add other flavors, and it really is as simple as that. You can customize a gin product by adding botanicals, distilling it, and bottling it. Right, Martin Miller's. So Miller's was launched in 1999. Which is actually the same year that Hendrick's was launched, and it was also about the same time that Tanqueray 10 was launched. So turn of the millennium was a really big time for gin, and some big products that changed things enormously. Now, Miller's it's not a brand that does a lot of activation these days. We don't see loads of it anymore, but back in the early noughties, about 18 years ago, this was a huge product. It was engaging with bartenders like few other products could. They were running cocktail competitions. I remember that because I entered one. I didn't win. Didn't even come close to winning. And they had this absurd production story whereby they would take the gin and then they would ship it to Iceland. They would put Icelandic spring water in it and then bring it back again. You can't get away with that sort of stuff these days because environmentalists would immediately be on you going, what the hell are you shipping it all the way there for, man? It's crazy, food miles and all that. But it was sort of like this insane quest for purity and perfection that I think captured people's attentions and said, yeah, this is interesting. They also had a secret ingredient in there as well, which is fun too. This idea that we're not going to disclose everything that's in this product and buy a bottle and then you can guess to see what the secret ingredient is. The secret ingredient, though, was cucumber. Now, I bet they were kicking themselves that they made it a secret, and they didn't just go, this has got cucumber in it, garnish it with cucumber, because, as we know from other brands, that's a reasonably successful way to sell lots of gin. But they kept it a secret, and they never jumped on that cucumber thing. But what they did do is they employed some great people to work on the brand. Particularly in Scotland, they had an amazing team of bartenders that were serving as part-time ambassadors. And it sold product. It got people interested in it. And again, we're thinking about a time when there weren't a lot of different products out there. So something that's different and that bartenders are getting excited about makes a great deal of difference. Bombay Sapphire and Laverstoke Mill. So the Bombay Spirits Company is actually much older than most people realize. It was founded in the 1950s. So although Bombay Sapphire sort of speaks of Victorian period and all that kind of stuff, it's not that old, but it is still a reasonably old product. Originally, it was Bombay London Dry, Bombay Original, and they launched Bombay Sapphire in the 80s. I think it was 86 or 87. So this is outside of our 20-year time period. But it's still important because it's still important to mention it within a 20-year time period because it didn't really gain a lot of traction internationally until the late 90s and early noughties. Now, I remember back in 2000, I was working in a pub and mostly pouring pints of beer, but I was also drinking lots of gin and tonics. The only gin we had there was Gordon's at the time, which is fine. And by the way, I still love Gordon's. But the manager of the pub got me a birthday present that year in 2000, and it was a square-shaped bottle, unwrapped, and lo and behold, there's this blue glass thing, Queen Victoria's face, and this gin, and you're like, wow, Jesus, I didn't know gin could look like this kind of elegant packaging. And it changed things for me, my whole perception of the category. And I'm pretty sure it changed it for everyone else. That first time that you discover Bombay Sapphire and you go, wow, this is something different. Now, as an extension of that is the opening of their distillery at Laverstoke Mill, which opened around about 3 or 4 years ago. Now, I mention that because if you go there, it's really like a gin theme park. This is not just your normal distillery with a tour. It's sort of inverted. It's like a gin experience that happens to have a distillery attached to it. And they have these amazing kind of glass greenhouses full of botanicals growing in there that are actually heated by heat that comes off the stills. An amazing kind of flavor experience, a bar, a restaurant, all sorts of stuff. And, with a company like that, Bacardi, investing so much money into distillery, it probably shows some confidence that this whole gin bubble is going to continue for quite a few more years, because you wouldn't be chucking the millions of quid at it that Bombay did. Classic cocktail renaissance. Now, this is one that shouldn't be underestimated. We've been in a period of renaissance now since, I guess it kind of started in the mid-80s, but properly kicking off towards the end of the 90s and the early 2000s. With some of the famous bars like Milk and Honey opening in New York, and the revival of some of the hotel bars. And during the course of that renaissance, we've continually looked back to old cocktail books, old recipes, trying to discover forgotten classics. And of course, there's so much material to refer to. And gin plays such an important part in the history of the cocktail. I mean, take the Savoy cocktail book. There's about 700 drinks in that book, and over half of them have got gin in them. So you can't really approach the subject of classic cocktails without engaging with gin. And of course, most of these cocktails were designed to be made with juniper-driven gins that would have been the only style available at that time, well, alongside things like Geneva. But with the new wave of gins, it's allowed a further kind of twisting and tweaking of classic recipes by introducing gins that have got other more esoteric botanicals in them. And we're sort of at a period now where we can take a classic cocktail like a Negroni and say, right, what's the perfect gin for this cocktail? And explore different botanical combinations matched with different vermouths and bitters and so on, and really tailor it to the bar or to the bartender or to a guest. And if it weren't for this kind of renaissance or cocktail revolution that we're experiencing right now, we just wouldn't have the need for so many different gins. Sure, the gin and tonics, of course, are a very popular product, or popular drink, but all these different classic cocktails demand that we have a range of gins. Super premiumization. Now, it wasn't that long ago that the idea of spending £30 or $40+ on a bottle of gin was totally absurd. I remember during a brief spell where I worked for Diageo, taking a bottle of Tanqueray 10 into a bar. This was probably about 12 years ago. Taking a bottle of Tanqueray 10 into a bar, showing it to the owner of the bar and saying, this is Tanqueray 10, it's amazing, you should stock it. And he laughed at me because of the price of the product and the entire idea that gin could be super premium. It just didn't fit with the category. That term, super premium, which we associate with cognac and with whiskey, even with vodka, but not with gin. Gin didn't seem to fit within the idea of a super premium product for him. But oh, how things have changed. I mean, the majority of the gins available in the UK now are £30+. And I think it was products like Tanqueray 10, like Oxley as well, which was another gin that has an absolutely absurd production process, that pushed the envelope with that and said, you know what? There is a level of craftsmanship and attention to detail and quality that can be found in a great gin that demands it cost more than £15 to £20 a bottle. And now, of course, new distilleries opening up, small craft distilleries, it's pretty standard that their products are £30, £35, £40, even £50 a bottle. It's just the way it is. I mean, they have to charge that much because the operations are so small. It's the only way they can make a margin. But it's sort of expected these days that that's what you pay for a small batch bottle of gin. The irony, of course, being that it doesn't in any way guarantee quality, but, What have we got next? Pace and agility. Now, one of the things that I identify, one of the sort of strings to gin's bow that I've identified over the last few years in its kind of rise and the proliferation of brands out there, is the fact that it can move and change so quickly. Unlike rum, tequila, whiskey, you can make a bottle of gin pretty damn quickly, okay? We could all crowdfund a distillery right now. Everyone puts in £300 or £400. We'll open our distillery tomorrow as soon as our still arrives, and the day after that, we'll have a product that we can put in a bottle. And that means you can start a gin distillery very quickly. And that's why we now have so many distilleries out there. The craft distilling, craft brewing kind of revolution, gin is the perfect poster boy for that because you can move so quickly and adapt and change. You can release a new product really quickly by introducing botanicals. The product's bottled the day after. Gin distilleries, for that reason, are also relatively inexpensive to set up. About £100,000 will get you a gin distillery, I reckon, in the UK. Whereas, if you're thinking about doing whiskey or something like that, you need to think about fermentation, you need to think about mashing, you need to think about where you're going to store all your barrels. You also need to think about how you're going to manage cash flow for 3 to 10 years or whatever until you actually release a product. With gin, you see a return on your investment on day 2. So yeah, super easy to set up. And it also means that you can customize to your local area as well. So all these different towns and cities that now have a gin, You can source botanicals that are native to the region or to your area or that are popular in local cuisine, tailor that product, get it out there, and really sort of capture people's attention with the identity that you've created of that product. Premium mixers. So again, like bitters have sort of piggybacked the gin renaissance and vice versa, I think the premium mixers have played a huge part as well, particularly in sort of establishing a level of quality in the gin and tonic. Now, I have nothing against the mixers that were around before the likes of Fever Tree came along. I've no problem with Schweppes and all that kind of stuff. I think they're perfectly good liquids to be mixing gin and tonics with. But the difference when Fever Tree and the rest of them came along is that they said, you know what? You should be considering what tonic water you're putting in there. No, theirs isn't necessarily better, but stop to think about it. Consider how you're mixing a gin and tonic and what it's going to taste like. Think about it. And once you start thinking about the mixer, of course, you then start thinking more about the gin and matching the two together. And all of a sudden, there is a vast range of customization options with your gin and tonic. Well, I'm going to use this tonic water with that gin, but with this gin, I'm going to use that tonic water. And you can switch it up, change it up, and of course, we've now got loads of flavored tonic waters as well, which is quite funny as well, since tonic water is already flavored. But Mediterranean tonic waters, elderflower, cucumber tonic water, all sorts of stuff. So suddenly, the number of permutations of gin and tonics is thousands and thousands, where 20 years ago, it was probably 5, and yeah, we see the success of these brands. Fever Tree now valued at over 4 billion, which is unbelievable. Plymouth Gin. Now, again, this might seem, especially considering we're counting up here to the most important landmark events, Plymouth Gin might seem like an interesting one to put in there, but it's a lot of firsts with Plymouth Gin. Besides the fact that it was a protected geographical region, Plymouth Gin was separate to London Dry, had to be made within the walls of Plymouth. And by the way, that came about as a result of quality control, because Plymouth Gin used to be one of the most counterfeited products back in the 1800s and 1900s. So it got a protected geographical distinction because they wanted to cut down on counterfeiters and ensure that the products were being made in Plymouth with Dartmoor spring water, sweet botanicals, and so on. But yeah, Plymouth was the first distillery in the UK, and probably the first gin distillery, besides maybe Thorigere in Minorca, to offer distillery tours. First gin distillery. And really great tour as well, because it's set in this old Blackfriars monastery and really beautiful building. They were also one of the first to do cocktail competitions as well. Plymouth Gin appeared in the first recipe or proto-recipe for a martini, or the Marguerite, in 1904, for the dry martini, sorry. And it generally sort of, when Plymouth was relaunched in 1997, it generally sort of said, look, we need to talk about quality. They changed from using a sugar beet-based distillate to using a grain-based distillate, really revamped the brand. And it was, again, a product that was different within that present marketplace at that time. Spain. So Spain has had a massive impact on the way that we look at gin, and specifically the gin and tonic. If you've been to Spain, some of you are probably from Spain. Statistically, it's quite likely. And you've been there and you've been served a gin and tonic. You get to experience a different kind of ritual around that drink. And long before we were obsessing over garnishes and what glass to put it in and ice quality and stuff like that, Spain had elevated the gin and tonic to a kind of godlike status amongst drinks. One way they do that is the Copa glass, of course. That big fishbowl glass means you can get more ice in there. Means you get more ice touching ice, which means you get less dilution, which is important, especially if you want the drink to be fizzy. And then there's the fact that your face gets right in that glass when you sip it. It does away with the straw, and you get that full facial contact. You get all those aromas coming off it. And it really is an experience, especially if you can avoid tipping like ice and gin all down your chin. the garnishing as well. You might have seen Spanish bartenders kind of getting lime zests and tongs and really grating that oil onto the surface of the gin and tonic. It's a proper ritual. And I guess the rest of the world sort of became aware of it about 10, 15 years ago. And we were like, wow, these guys love gin and tonics here. How cool is that? And then you go there and drink one, you go, damn it, no wonder they love it, because they make them better than anywhere else. And it's now kind of filtered all around the world. We've seen brands giving away their own branded Copa glasses. They're a nightmare for bars, though, because they're so big. Like, you fill up a whole shelf of like 4 glasses. Anyway, had the backing of Ferran Adria as well, one of the, at the time, sort of the world's most celebrated chef. You know, you don't get much better than that. And yeah, I think we've probably kind of got over the Copa glass a little bit now. Like, I don't see so many bars using them, probably because they're a nightmare to store. But certainly some of that obsession is still there in the gin and tonic, and that's why we have all these different ways of garnishing and preparing. Sipsmith. Now, Sipsmith was a landmark distillery opening because it basically became the prototype for every other gin distillery that opened ever since, globally. From the type of stills they use, which are German origin, eau de vie stills, to product packaging, to how a craft gin brand was marketed. They basically wrote the textbook on it. First licensed copper pot still in London for 200 years. They actually changed laws in order to get that pushed through. Showed us that gin can remain gin, but still feel kind of exciting and innovative. I mean, it's a pretty classic London dry gin. It's built off that Tanqueray Beefeater formula, juniper forward. But it feels special because it's new and it's a London product. And yeah, it just became that model distillery for everything that came afterwards. I've been to a lot of gin distilleries, and they pretty much all use that kind of Sipsmith formula. We're nearly there now. We've only got a couple left to go. So Hendrick's and the Cucumber. First thing about Hendrick's, again, it's a gin that isn't juniper forward. It smells more of rose than it does juniper. There's still a juniper characteristic to it. Doesn't really smell of cucumber to me, although it's got cucumber in it. I personally find it to be quite rose-scented. Of course, everyone thinks it smells and tastes of cucumber because they put a big slice of cucumber in their gin and tonic, and then they go, oh, it tastes of cucumber. Yes, well, any gin will taste of cucumber if you put cucumber in gin and tonic. Quirky Victorian illustration, despite the fact it wasn't Victorian. This is in 1999, this product was first created. But yeah, the cucumber garnish was really the major breakthrough. It goes back to that whole thing of like, when I was talking about Gordon's and the lime wedge, that cucumber garnish suggests, you know what? It's a gin and tonic, but we can be innovative. We can kind of change the way that this drink looks and feels. Garnish it with something simple to prepare, cheap, that looks cool, and actually does kind of bleed a little bit of flavor into the drink. Very clever stuff. They weren't the first to do it, though. As it says on the slide up here, Gordon's and Seagram's both marketed gin and tonics garnished with cucumbers back in the 70s. If you do a Google search, you'll find some of those adverts with it garnished with a cucumber. So it wasn't a new idea, and as I've already mentioned, Miller's were using cucumber in their gin too. Tanqueray 10, and to a smaller extent, Tanqueray Malacca. Now, I remember the first bottle of Tanqueray 10 that I bought, and I was bartending. I was working in the first cocktail bar I'd worked in. I think it was about 2001. And this product, I became aware of this product, which was pretty new at the time. It came out in 99 or 2000, somewhere around that time. And I already loved Tanqueray. And this sort of idea of a line extension of Tanqueray gin really excited me. I was like, right, you're building off the kind of quality of Tanqueray, but then adding something new to it. That might sound silly to say that, but no other gin had done line extensions at that time. It was just one product for each brand. And I got hold of a bottle of Tanqueray 10 and read up on it. By the way, reading up on it in 2001 wasn't that easy. You know, we were in early internet sort of days back then as well. It wasn't just like, oh, I'll get on the Wikipedia page of Tanqueray and find out what this is about. So I did a little bit of research and found that it was made using this special production process. Tiny little still, the smallest still being used to make gin in the UK at that time. They'd redistill Tanqueray London Dry, and they'd add in chamomile and grapefruit. One single grapefruit per distillation run. They just cut it in half, chuck it in the still. And that in itself was innovative. The idea of distilling fresh fruit, not dried peels, fresh fruit. I mean, have you ever tried sort of cooking fresh fruit? It generally tastes pretty rank. Like, it goes all stewed and horrible, and all that kind of nuance and brightness that you expect to find is lost. But somehow, Tom Nicol, the former distiller of Tanqueray 10, managed to do some witchcraft with this still and work out a way of capturing those grapefruit oils without them becoming stewed. Now, I got this bottle of Tanqueray 10, I remember, and I made a gin and tonic and a martini for my wife and I. I like being double parked with drinks, by the way. Sort of gin and tonic with a martini just to wash it down. We made these drinks, and I remember the moment I took a sip of the gin and tonic, and I was like, whoa, this is like an epiphany. And for years afterwards, I called Tanqueray 10 Gin 2.0. I considered it to be the next step, the next evolution of gin, because the brightness of it, the finesse, the detail of flavor, the clarity of that product still, for me, makes it my favorite gin in the world. And when I did this tasting I mentioned earlier of the 100 gins, most popular, 100 most popular gins in the UK a few weeks ago, it's a blind tasting. I picked out Tanqueray 10 like that, straight away, from the aroma. And that's because there really isn't anything like it. I think any other gin distiller would love to sort of learn the secrets of how on earth this product's possible. And yeah, I already mentioned about super premiumization. It was more expensive, quite rightly, because it was really great. But it kind of pushed the envelope in that way as well. And it's still doing that today. I've mentioned Malacca there as well, which was launched around that time too, and again, another line extension. Of course, it was famously pulled, and then bottles of Tanqueray Malacca became incredibly expensive. Then they relaunched it about, 5 or 6 years ago? And now Tanqueray actually have about 7 different products, I think, lots of different flavored gins. I once went to the Diageo archives in Scotland, and I got a chance to flick through Charles Tanqueray's notebook, which has got all sorts of recipes in it, not just for gin, not just for spirits, but all sorts of stuff, including boot polish and like medicine for horses and stuff like that. Anyway, when I was there, I took a photo of one of the recipes on the camera I had with me, and then I went home, and in my garage at that time, and this was probably like 2006, I had a still in my garage. I was making my own spirits, illegally making my own spirits in the UK. Not selling them, just for drinking purposes and for family and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, I decided I'd have a go at making this recipe for this gin that I'd found in Charles Tanqueray's book. It was called Common Gin. So I made it. I got all the botanicals, distilled it, and I did this big blog post online saying, I've made this gin out of Charles Tanqueray's book. I put up the picture I'd taken in the archives. About an hour later, I got a phone call from like someone very high up in the legal department at Diageo saying, right, take that down off the internet now. Take the photo down, take the blog post down, otherwise we are going to put you in jail. Like, you're in deep, deep trouble. So I did take it all down. And funnily, about 3 years ago, they launched Tanqueray Bloomsbury. Tanqueray Bloomsbury. You recognize it because it's got a handwritten kind of recipe on the bottle. It's sort of printed on the label. That was the gin recipe that I stole from the archives and made. And Diageo subsequently released it. It's tasty gin. One final one. The most important thing to happen in gin in the last 20 years, by far, is the launch of the Curious Bartender's Gin Palace, of course. Available in all good stores. And you should go out and buy a copy. Cool, I'm done. That's me. Thanks ever so much for coming. I hope that was interesting, and I'll see you for a drink later.